some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Freeman and Dr. Gill for being here today. They're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a 30-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. A 50% off discount code and a link to the book on our website can be found in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Tyrone McKinley Freeman's work examines African American philanthropic agency in historical and contemporary contexts, with an emphasis on the ways in which African Americans have used philanthropy to express their dignity and humanity, as well as to survive and press for massive social reform. He is Assistant Professor of Philanthropic Studies and Director of Undergraduate Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at IUPUI. Previously, he was a professional fundraiser for social services, community development, and higher education organizations. He was also Associate Director of the Fundraising School, where he trained nonprofit leaders in the United States, Africa, Asia, and Europe. His research has appeared in O, USA Today, Time, Newsweek, News One, Blavity, The Conversation, Black Perspectives, Chronicle of Philanthropy, and the Stanford Social Innovations Review. He is co-author of Race, Gender, and Leadership in Nonprofit Organizations, published by Palgrave Macmillan. Dr. Freeman is a proud HBCU graduate, having earned his BA in English and Liberal Arts from Lincoln University. You can follow him on Twitter at McKinley Tyrone. Dr. Tiffany M. Gill is an Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University. She is the author of Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry, published by the University of Illinois Press, which received the 2010 Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Prize by the Association of Black Women Historians. She is also co-editor of To Turn the Whole World Over, Black Women and Internationalism, also published by the University of Illinois Press. Dr. Gill's research has been supported by various foundations, including the American Association of University Women and the National Endowment of the Humanities. An award-winning teacher and a nationally recognized expert in African American women's history, fashion and beauty culture, business history, and travel and migration studies, she has provided expert commentary for various news outlets, including NPR, C-SPAN, CNBC, Vox, The Washington Post, and New York Times. Dr. Gill has served as a consultant for Sephora and as a historical advisor for Higher Ground, the film and television production company founded by President Barack and Michelle Obama. Named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians and a Regents Outstanding Teacher while on the faculty at the University of Texas, Gill has also been recognized by Diverse Issues in Higher Education as one of the top 25 women in higher education. Gill is currently at work on a book chronicling the promise and peril of African American international leisure travel. You can find her on social media at Sable Victorian. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Freeman and Dr. Gill. Thanks again for everyone for being here today.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Tyrone. Good evening to all of you who are joining us via Zoom. That is one of the good things about this crazy time we live in, is that at least it allows us to speak across all sorts of geographical boundaries. And so this is a bit of a University of Illinois party, right, Tyrone? I mean,
that's right.
I too am a University of Illinois Press author twice over. I always say they do wonderful work and do the best covers in the game, the best book covers in the game. And so, and do great work. And it's really just an honor to come here and chat with you about this incredible book that has just been such a delight to just see it come to fruition. We were talking the other day in preparation for this about when we first met. Was that 2013, 14?
It was 2014, yeah.
Yes. I just moved here to Philadelphia and we met at the Black Doctoral Network.
Yes.
At a panel, which I think had to have been Madam's doing, right? Because it was a panel about scholars negotiating well on the job market. And I can't help but think that that's something Madam would have been very glad for both of us to be at. She was always, an advocate to make sure that Black folks got what they deserved financially. So I think that was a bit of Madam sort of working her magic still.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I did not know you were going to be there. And I walked in, there was only seats up front. And so I got up to the front, I sat down, and then you said, "Hi, everybody, I'm Tiffany Gill." And my jaw dropped. I was like, oh my God, because I had never seen you before. And I was just so excited to be in your presence. So this to have you here tonight. So thank you.
This is fun. This is fun. So let's jump into this incredible book and the incredible journey to this book. And I mean, to me, what we see is the final beautiful product, which if you haven't seen it yet, and I know there's a link in the chat for folks to get it at a discount. But what was the journey to this book, right? Books start long before their dissertations or books, or long before you even get to graduate school, right? There are things about your life and sort of your journey that contribute and brought you to the study of Black philanthropy and to Walker in particular. So share with us just a little bit about your journey to this book. How did this idea even start for you?
Yeah, thank you. And let me just say thank you to the press for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. This goes back to my upbringing in the Black church. I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Black Baptist preachers and first ladies, and everybody else who wasn't in the pulpit was a usher or a trustee or a deacon, right? Just involved. And so I grew up in this very generous community, and actually it was through the church where I learned Black history, right? Because the public school systems weren't doing that kind of thing. But you remember the Martin Luther King fans and the Black history posters, right? It's kind of like that's where I get introduced to this and introduced to Madam. And so her story had been with me. And so I grew up on the East Coast, but came out to the Midwest for graduate school. And so to be kind of close to where her legacy, was kind of laid down, and to have access to her archives, there was this combination of things that came together. And so I come from this philanthropic tradition. I have a generous family, a generous community. So I knew it existed. And yet working as a professional fundraiser, and I'm in this profession, and I'm usually the only African-American fundraiser in the room, and this space doesn't get this tradition, doesn't get Black donors, and it's not engaging them, right? And then fast forward, I'm in the university studying. My PhD is actually in philanthropic studies, and the literature there is not engaging Black people as agents of philanthropy. And so both of these professional spaces dedicated to philanthropy are just missing, this something that was just basic to me and fundamental to me. And so it was the opportunity to try to bridge that gap, which kind of led me down this pathway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. And you can definitely see where your sort of understanding of where ideas and where generosity is cultivated coming through in the book in the way that you portray Madam's story, right? So you take us, Madam C.J. Walker is a name that's familiar to many of us. Granted, a lot of what folks know or think they know about Madam Walker is usually a little narrow and sometimes a little wrong about her inventing straightening combs, and she just becomes this sort of atypical figure, right? This washerwoman, rags to riches, American dream story. And I think your narrative really complicates that for us, right? You take us on this journey of Walker as an impoverished washerwoman, through her rise to be a beauty mogul and entrepreneur, and then even through her afterlife in some ways, in terms of her legacy of giving, even after she left. And what I love is that it's not this rags to riches ascendancy, but because I love the way you frame her philanthropy, not in her wealth, but actually in her years of poverty, right? That her early life and her early foundation is actually what informs what kind of giving she does in the future. So talk a little bit about that, how you were able to situate her story really not in her excessive wealth, but in the institutions and the things that made her when she was very young.
Yeah, well, there's so many things that go into this because I was digging into the archives, and you've been to the archives, so there's receipts here, there's gift receipts there's reports and that sort of thing, and I was really trying to grapple with how to make sense of this, and the historiography in my field wasn't helping me because the history of American philanthropy is all about the elite white men who created foundations and kind of transformed the way philanthropy is done, and so but that doesn't explain what I was seeing in these archives. So it combination of being able to connect with Alelia Bundles and just saying, I'm trying to do something here on philanthropy. And, she drops this little tip, well, I don't know, but there's something about those women in the church. Check that out, right? And so I dig into that, and that kind of starts opening up the world of possibilities. And I was already familiar with some of the work done by great Black women, Darlene Clark Hine, Betty Collier Thomas, and others. But it's like then kind of finding my way deeper into that literature through the support of colleagues and through my own kind of curiosity and investigations. And that becomes the literature that makes sense. That becomes the place where I can start putting together constructs and frameworks for making sense what I see. And so you're right. It's in this instance, philanthropy is not about wealth. It has nothing to do about that. And Carnegie kind of sets the mold here, right? Even today, the elite kind of model themselves after Andrew Carnegie. You spend your life accumulating wealth, and then later in life, you turn towards others and start doing things. And Walker's doing something fundamentally different. She's giving as she can because she knows the struggle. She's part of the struggle. She's still wrestling with it. She can never be free from it, no matter how much money she has, right? And as you said, this puts her in the context of her peers, because this is what so many Black women were doing in her time and did before her. And so I try to show what we know about the networks that she came out of, the washerwomen, the club women, the church women, and how these things lead to this idea of philanthropy. And I use that to articulate this idea of the embodied generosity of Black women to contribute back something to this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the greatest contributions of your work, coming to this from my side as a Black women's historian, not someone who studies in philanthropy, but you say in your book that you want to reconceptualize who counts as a philanthropist and what counts as philanthropy. And so just talk a little bit about that. And then also thinking about the differences that you see between philanthropy and generosity, because that's a word that you often connect throughout the book with Walker, is that she's doing what is philanthropy, but I think you're really trying to just shatter the frameworks of philanthropy and offer something new. So how does Walker's life give us something new to offer?
Yeah, in the public perception and even in the media coverage, right, the face of philanthropy is still largely white, and it's largely very elite. And it's kind of this disconnect, and people don't know how they feel about the term philanthropist, right? There's some ambivalence there. And so what I was trying to do and saying, well, this community may not necessarily always use that term, but the things that they're doing, right, these voluntary actions that are informed by this sense of justice, this sense of the way things should be, right, trying to overcome these systems that are holding people back, right? That is what we talk about when we study philanthropy, or when we celebrate it in the media. It's about people making gifts to deal with things. Now, there's problems with philanthropy too, right? But what I was trying to do here is to say, hey, there other people were giving too. It's not just about the elites. And so to put Madam Walker back into the context of her peers, and you can see that. So I argue that her educator, club women, church women friends are philanthropists, right? And that what happens when we start viewing them as philanthropists, that I think a new world opens up, new ways of understanding what they're doing. And I hope it also gives access to that generosity, the dispositions with which they did this, the way they gave of themselves. It wasn't just utilitarian. They're not just fundraising because you have to do these things. They're not just kind of arguing for their own rights because you have to. In many ways, this is a gift, right, back to the country itself, to hold the country accountable, to challenge it, to become what it says it wants to be. And that's the way that Black women have just fundamentally transformed the country throughout this history, and are continuing to do that to this day. So generosity kind of speaks to, again, where this comes from, this kind of unspoken sacred part of them that was acting and pursuing these dreams and these visions for the way things should be, and meeting the needs. And I also argue that it's a way that Madam unified her identity as a woman, as a mother, as an entrepreneur, as a race woman, that all these things are expressed through her giving towards others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the genre of this book, which I think is really kind of path-breaking, particularly when we're looking at African-American history. And so, you have that quote in there from Du Bois from 1909, where he says, few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro, right? And even today, when you look at statistics in terms of wealth and in terms of racial breakdown, that African Americans typically give more than, and percentage-wise, otherwise in other kinds of communities. So let's talk about this idea of a philanthropic biography, right? So a lot of us have been in the trenches with Madam Walker, right? Have been in those incredible archives in Indiana Historical Society, and we've looked at her and we've made contributions, right? There have even been popular treatments of her life, which we can talk about later on, the self-made mini-series. But what does a philanthropic biography give? And not even just thinking about it in Walker, but I'm thinking of it in terms of like, what have we been missing? Scholars of African-American history, what does the study of philanthropy bring to our work, particularly those who work on Black women, right? So what does a philanthropic biography bring to the field that really sort of challenges it? And what have we been missing by ignoring this important aspect of Black people's lives?
Yeah, I hope it brings a new way of looking at our subjects, right? And the people in the communities that are kind of the basis of our intellectual agendas. By philanthropic biography, I was trying to articulate this idea of when you take this figure and you center philanthropy as a way of viewing that life, the way in which this person gave of themselves to try to address different issues and whatever that looks like, that you can get a new understanding of that person and you can gain another understanding of philanthropy itself. Because in the African-American tradition, and I articulate my own definition of African-American philanthropy, right, to try to get to this idea that it's not about wealth, it's about responding to the oppression, the issues going on, but then it's also bigger than that. I'm so glad you mentioned Du Bois, right? Because in his 1909 study, where he studies Black philanthropy, believe it or not, right? The height of Jim Crow, Black philanthropy is enough of a thing that he does this study. And this is his second study, by the way, right? And he says that this goes back to pre-colonial Western Africa, right? That this comes out of those family and communal structures, and it traversed the Atlantic, and Gertrude Moselle says the same thing, right? So it's trying to articulate this generosity that, yes, it was responsive and it was the basis for Black survival of the absurdity of their American experience. But by anchoring it back to Africa, then that suggests it's something bigger. That suggests that it's tapping into the humanity there, which I think is powerful. And so the philanthropic biography, I hope, is a way to center that and to say, here's another way of looking at that. As I was exposed to the way many Africana studies scholars examine philanthropy and where many people in my field do, there's a lot of attention on what white people have done for African Americans from a philanthropic standpoint. There's less attention on what African Americans were doing for themselves and using that lens of philanthropy. So in many ways, philanthropy is this external thing that comes in and is imposed upon the community and kind of has its way with the community and then leaves. And there are critiques, and that's important. Those things have happened, right? But there's this other side when we look at philanthropy from the community's perspective itself and what they're trying to do, what values they're representing, what world they're trying to create, how are they trying to survive. That gives us access to the other part of philanthropy. And so that's what I'm trying to articulate. And I'm hoping, encouraging scholars to engage, because I've learned so much from Black women's historians doing this. I hope that kind of philanthropy is something, a contribution back that can help you all think about, and because I was amazed again by the extent of the historiography and how much it resonated with core debates and conversations in my field. And I thought, wow, if these scholars have done this much without a primary intellectual commitment to philanthropy, imagine if they had one, right? Because philanthropy is something they had to deal with, because as I say in the book, you cannot study the history of African Americans without encountering their philanthropy. But it's unfortunate that you can study the history of philanthropy and not encounter African Americans, right? And in many ways, Black women's historians are leading the way in helping us understand this. And so this book was a way for me to pull all those things together, speak to these philanthropic studies debates, speak to some of the Black women's history debates, and also open up ideas for everyday givers and practitioners in the field.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, when you do Black women's history, and this is something that historian Juliet Walker always says, is, follow the money, right? Yeah. And when you're in the archives of Black women, ordinary Black women activists, no matter what, and if you happen to come across one of their little checkbook registers, right? Yeah. Always study that carefully, and you will see that so much of what they're doing is going out into sort of giving to different kind of institutions and things like that. But I want us to think about, and I think your work really addresses this, sort of the critiques of philanthropy, right? In terms of its limitations. We see what it's been able to do. I mean, I think it's arguable that, you know, Black communities would not have been sustained and are still being sustained by the generosity of Black women. But this can often come at a cost, right? We even think about Walker's personal life, right? She died, you know, one of the things when you're doing the archival work and the Walker papers, and you're sort of going chronologically and you're reading her letters, and you know how sick she is, right? She's burnt out, she's stressed, you know in 1919 she's going to die, but there's a part of me when I was reading through some of them, like, you know, like, go take care of yourself, right? Like, stop carrying the race, right? So let's talk about that, like the real consequences, right? We don't want it to fall into the kind of superwoman myth, right? That unburden that Black women are always so having to carry. But often we can see this generosity in some ways killed Walker, right? And in some ways can be killing Black women. So what can we learn about that? Both, you know, the promise of her life as a philanthropist, but also the real toil that it took upon her and others physically who felt such a compulsion to carry the race in some ways.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very important. You know, she died of stress-related illness, right? And so, and we know also now the real effects of racism on the body, right? Doctors have articulated that, and medical scientists have articulated that. So she is carrying all those. She's just relentless. She's moving from city to city. She's pushing the company. She's talking to any and everybody she can, and that does take a toll. And so one of the things that I have been very pleased to see is that in the professional world of philanthropy and fundraising, Black women are organizing themselves now in ways we haven't seen. There's a new group called Woke, which is Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy. There's another group called the Rooted Collaborative. And these are Black women fundraisers who are coming together and saying, hey, we're here, we're in these spaces where, again, we typically are the only ones, right? But we're coming together, we're creating spaces of fellowship where we can take care of our whole selves because we're bringing our whole selves to this work. And so, and when you look at the kinds of meetings and conferences they're holding, they're talking about their whole selves. They're dealing with mental health. They're dealing with being wives and mothers and fundraisers. And so they have the nuts and bolts strategy. How do you raise, you know, money from high net worth people, but they also are trying to take care of themselves. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are encouraging. And we know many of the Black Lives Matter activists, right? There's this whole stream of taking care of yourself and mental health and those kinds of things because they've seen toll that this has historically taken on the community. So you're right, it definitely is a cautionary tale in many ways, and kind of giving of yourself to the point where you have nothing left for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then also thinking about philanthropy and its limitations, particularly, you know, within a capitalist society where, you know, that is racialized and gendered, full of inequality, based on inequality, right? In some ways, you know, at its least, philanthropy does not overturn the very pernicious systems of racism and sex-based discrimination. But also, in some ways, some might even argue that philanthropy allows for capitalism's inequalities to continue. And so I want to hear both from you and from your perspective from Walker, right? Because I think she was very aware of the systematic conditions that kept Black women and Black people imperiled, right? And her philanthropy was connected not just to giving money, as your book shows, but to a much wider vision that does include political activism. And so talk a little bit about how you figure her political activism in the book and her educational activism as a part of her larger vision of philanthropy to address the very real inequalities that come through in a capitalist system.
Yeah. So I think it's important to remember that, right? Madam Walker achieves not because of the system, in spite of the system. right? That the whole history of Black business is about these entities surviving in a hostile environment that does not want them to exist, right? That Black businesses are to be burned down and destroyed, right? During riots, they're not to be protected and invested in and that sort of thing. So we've got to remember that first, right? So she's already operating within a system that's not meant for her success. Certainly not as as an African American, and certainly not as a woman, right? So that's important. So I think I articulate this idea that she's kind of outside of all of that, because this is part of that race woman philosophy, that you have to engage this struggle and contribute something is your obligation, and it's kind of all hands on deck. And so and I say in the book that she uses her company as kind of a third C. We've already got the clubs, we got the churches, and so the company becomes this base where she's doing the same things that the club women and the church women are doing, just from her unique platform. And other entrepreneurs have done this too. So it's really important to kind of, those are the kinds of connections I was making, so that they can try to develop their customer bases and try to develop some sort of material success and create avenues of opportunity for people. But they also know that that's for a purpose, and that serves this purpose of trying to uplift the race, even as problematic as uplift philosophy is, right? That's what she's trying to do. And she's really dedicated to this. And you see her private correspondence and her public statements are very much matching up in these ways. And so that's why I argue that her company is this gift in some ways, by providing this opportunity. In a Jim Crow society that wants Black people to be in menial positions, not have opportunities for advancement, you could become a Walker agent and you can begin to take care of your family in ways that the other opportunities available don't, right? And so that's something fundamentally different, and cause for looking at this with a different lens. Because today we're very suspicious of businesses and corporations. All the Black Lives Matter statements, everybody's like, yeah, show me the money, or what are you going to really do, right? But I think this is a different context, because again, if the government is actively working against you, and the private markets are actively working against you, and the nonprofit sector, even though we didn't really use that term during this historical period, those white social service agencies and white schools are discriminating, won't take Black children, won't take Black elderly. You have to turn in and do for yourself. And that's what I'm trying to give more voice to, and try to make these connections to what Black women's historians have done, because they've already excavated this tremendous history of how these organizations rose and how Black women were building institutions to meet these needs. I wanted to bring that into this philanthropy conversation, because they're doing something fundamentally different than Carnegie's doing. The system is working for Carnegie, even though he's being barraged with critiques and threats and from the government and everything. The system's working for Rockefeller. It's not working for Walker. So these things are happening in spite of all that. And even when we think about women's philanthropy, the models there are white women. So somebody like Olivia Sage becomes the premier example, who was based in New York, who inherited money from her husband, and then she started a foundation in his name, the Sage Foundation. Scholars will be familiar with that, right? She opened up universities for women. She funded the environment and did all these incredible things, right? But she's the quote unquote woman of leisure, right? She is, having resources, inherited. Walker has no one to inherit from, right? And Walker is in the economy, right, from her earliest years, working as a washerwoman, and never leaves it. So it's just even a different relationship to the modes of production altogether. So these are just fundamentally different contexts. And that's where I say this is a work of protest against those prevailing models, to say that other people were trying to bring about their own visions of society and the ways in which they would live a generous life too, that aren't captured by the way we tend to think about philanthropy based on the elites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the writing of the book is really lovely. And one of my favorite sentences that you have, which goes along with what you were just saying, is that, according to America's plan for Black people during Jim Crow, Madam C.J. Walker was not supposed to happen, right? So her very sort of existence and her tenacity, and that she not only created this business, but this business that, was a platform of economic security for many African-American women, and then through her generosity in other ways. Just, she wasn't just not supposed to happen, they didn't want, like she was, like you said, a threat to the very foundation of these systems. And I think your work shows that well. And one of the things I think is really interesting when we think about what this book can sort of speak to, I think one of the things that's really great about it is how resonant it is to a lot of the concerns that we're looking at today, right? And one of them is this way that, you know, philanthropy, the model that you've laid out, the way that it's typically been done is very much tied to sort of individual, I think, particularly in our contemporary moment, right? I was thinking a lot about when crises happen, and just yesterday in Philadelphia, where I lived, another African-American man was gunned down in the street in front of his family. We think about, you know, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these folks, right? And one thing we always have to think about, and we're in this moment of social protest, is that movements cost money. Which is we often think about them as these very kind of ideological spaces, but every aspect of a movement costs money in some ways. And so we see a lot of Walker's generosity and sort of her generosity of getting together with her agents and the people who worked with her was to give in political ways, right? Walter White says, you know, without Walker's money, the NAACP would not have made it, right? And so just thinking about that, and why I think today so many corporations have sort of jumped in on the kind of Black Lives Matter philanthropy side, is because a lot of the institutional infrastructures that Black folks had that often were the spaces that channeled money out don't seem to exist, right? So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about Walker's. She was an institution woman, right? She was an institution builder, right? And I think about institution building and movement building, and how institution building doesn't really seem to be a part of the conversation in our kind of current social moment, right? Even when we think about philanthropy, we're more likely to see it through GoFundMes and other kinds of things that are very kind of individual and pointed. So talk about some of the institutions that Walker sort of was engaged in. What kind of institution building was she engaged with, and how that connected to her idea of generosity and philanthropy?
Sure. Well, so first, of course, there's her company, right? And we just talked about some of those opportunities. But right then, to extend that and start, you know, creating a network of schools so that she becomes this educator, which is kind of something we don't really pay attention to. I was so excited when Beauty Shop Politics came out because you addressed, you know, some of the work she was doing through some of the schools. And so it's like, it's important, again, to think about the whole struggle over education in our history, and to see her kind of step up and start, you know, offering that. It's really powerful. And so, and the Walker credential meant something. You could actually, you know, change your family's life by getting that diploma and start selling products or doing hair out of your living room. And then for her, there's examples in the archive where, you know, it may be too much to call it a program, but she actually incubated salons by giving some women money to renovate a facility or build something and get them started, right? So she is definitely trying to build this entrepreneurial ethos in this racial uplift context to support Black women. And then she brings the agents together into clubs. So she creates her own national network of clubs so that, you know, she can protect the brand, she can help them know each other, because there are imposters, right, in different regions that are taking the labels off her products and putting theirs on it and that whole thing, right? But she also says to them, you've got to do charity, right? So kind of sell the products and engage the struggle. And the agents respond. There's all these, you know, these reports in the archive about, you know, we just raised money for the NAACP, or we just donated furniture to these Black colleges. And they certainly raised their collective voices to speak out against lynching through the resolution to President Wilson, right? So she's definitely building those kinds of things. She becomes one of NACW's most treasured members, even though, right, she kind of crosses those class barriers, right, to be kind of the object of NACW programming, to become a treasured member. So she's helping in that, and goes regularly to those conventions and gives money to Frederick Douglass's home and these kinds of things, helps them with their projects and their activities. She also was part of a fraternal order. So the Order of the Court of Calanthe is a place where I kind of explore their history and their emphasis on charity and engagement too, and potential impact on her. So she's on the front lines. And so then you throw in, oh yeah, she's supporting the anti-lynching movement. She's involved with voting rights for women. She's just on the front lines, and she's trying to respond, trying to engage. And she represents this whole generation that gave what they could to try to keep these things going. And of course they wanted relief. They wanted liberation, right? But they didn't live to see it. but they propelled those organizations forward, and the next generations were able to keep going. So as you said, right, so the NAACP was ready for that moment, when things start to culminate in the 50s in ways that have been building up for decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's different, right? It's she's giving through these institutions, and not just giving in a solitary way, but inspiring others to give, right? So literally, when she'd get her agents together, there would be, they talk their kind of industry stuff, but so much of their gathering was about their obligation to the race and what they should be doing. And so I think that, and sort of the difference of the models of the kind of GoFundMe models we have, it's sort of spurring on, but it's a sort of give once and you're done. It's not through an institutional culture where this sort of obligation continues. And so I think this book is really instructive for all of us, particularly if we're having critiques about the kind of corporatization of the Black Lives Matter model. What I think Walker and her activism gives us, it provides another kind of way to be able to fund movements and to be able to make actual engagement and change. And I also wanted to ask, I meant to ask this at the beginning, but with your title and sort of the framework that you provide around philanthropy, this idea of a gospel of giving, right? Yeah. Which, and just about that phrase, talk about the kind of religious connections, both that Walker had, but also how that was also linked to her giving and her sort of larger institution building as well.
Yeah, so it's a critique of Carnegie, right? Because his philosophy has been called a gospel of wealth, and this is saying no, the giving starts in just a generosity, not in how much money you have. But then you're right; it goes back to her roots in the AME church, and this is again where this whole universe opens up when you go back and you look at the historiography and try to see the church through Sarah's eyes as she enters St. Louis in the late 1890s with her daughter in tow, connects with her family. She's greeted by this robust philanthropic social infrastructure that was anchored by St. Paul's African Methodist Episcopal Church, because they had been receiving nail painters, exodusters, right, over the previous decade, right? And so they had, there's this orphanage, there's an old folks home, there's this network, they're settling people and helping them either whether they're going to stay or move on. And so it becomes this important place of refuge. And so these women in the church, right, are nurturing her, taking her under their wing through their Mite Missionary Society. They're responding to needs in the community. And so this is where she begins to report that she starts giving. So she's barely, she's still in the thick of her own struggle, and she joins these women and starts to give, starts raising money, starts gathering food items for sick neighbors, and starting to participate in the organizations of the church that are been anchored by these women, and we know are basis for women to exert their own autonomy, right? So it very much speaks to that. And then if you just take the theology, the ways in which the AME Church used the gospel to respond to give Black people a sense of their history beyond what the Jim Crow narrative said about Black life, anchoring them back to Africa. I mean, you could imagine her being from Delta, Louisiana, and having bishops and all these people, these itinerant preachers coming through and talking about, building schools in Africa. I mean, this had to be like just a whole new, like, Black people are doing all this, like, really, so, and so she gets to be a part of this, this kind of this FUBU culture, this for us, by us, right? That we're building these institutions, we're using our resources to do it. We're trying to bring down this system, and we're trying to survive day to day. But in the process of doing that, they also are expressing something that's fundamentally human about themselves, their own dignity, their own generosity.
Yeah. I love that. And in your conclusion, one of the things you do, which I think is really great and comes out of the philanthropy study side, is that you sort of are providing guidance in some ways, and sort of thinking about what this work does in providing a foundation for future studies of Black women's philanthropy, but I think also just for Black communities and thinking about giving and philanthropy. I'm part of a giving circle here in Philadelphia, and sort of how we're trying to work through these issues ourselves in terms of how we want to give and why we want to give and what kind of impact. And one of the things you leave the reader with 5 characteristics for sort of directions for future research in this area of looking at Black Women in Philanthropy, and you talk about, and all of them are really important, and I encourage folks to read and really go through them, because it really sort of made me think about myself and my own kind of philanthropic work is, the idea of proximity, and sort of this, one of the keys of sort of, the very kind of white-led philanthropic movements is about sort of distance between the giver and the receiver, right? And so proximity was something that was key with Walker, resourcefulness, collaboration, right? That it's not an individualized thing, but much more collaborative. Incrementalism, sort of building up to it. And the last piece that is the one I want to talk to you about is joy. Okay. Right. And so what role did joy play in Walker's giving, and why is that an important element when we think about sort of Black philanthropy and Black women's philanthropy in particular?
Yeah, so in some early interviews in 1912, 1914, Madam Walker states to the Indianapolis Freeman interviewer who's visiting with her that, she's a cheerful giver. So she's drawing inspiration from 2 Corinthians, right? And so she's living out that gospel. But then also in the correspondence between her and her attorney, Freeman B. Ransom, when she's drafting her will, she talks about how excited she is to be figuring out how to give her items away. And she wishes that she could do this now, that she would get so much pleasure and joy out of it. And there's a few other references where this idea of joy keeps coming up. And what was so powerful for me is the larger context is this movement called scientific philanthropy. It's something that starts in England as kind of this Enlightenment development that says charity is causing harm. When you give a poor, hungry person something to eat, you have solved their hunger for tonight, but tomorrow they're still going to be hungry, and you're just kind of creating dependency. So we need a new philanthropy, a scientific philanthropy that's going to step back and apply science and rationalism to the social issues of the day and say, how do we get to the root cause and stop all this impulsive charity that's not really relieving people, right? So in the midst of this kind of movement, and it jumped upon, it came to the US at the charity organization societies and other groups embrace it. And so in that context, for her to articulate this joy, it's going against that grain. It's expressing that emotional aspect of it, that connection to people and how it's making her feel. And now 100 years later, one of my colleagues is a psychologist in philanthropy, and she studies the fact, there are biochemical changes. There are things that are happening that do make us feel happy, that make us feel good when we give of ourselves to others. So she's articulating this at a time when that's not the trend in philanthropy. And I thought that was very important. And that goes back again to the dispositions and this overall generosity with which this work was done. Because yes, it was hard. Yes, it was a struggle, and it was ever present. But there's something else going on, and that's what I wanted to, use these quotes from her and these contexts to try to articulate.
Yeah, that's great. Black women leading the way, right? And ideas that they're now sort of catching up with scientifically. Just as we wrap up here, I think the work that you do with Walker's legacy is wonderful. We won't have time to really talk about it, but even thinking about her will and her desires and how we even think about, as scholars, how we even read wills. And you give us a really nice kind of methodology of what we actually learn in wills, which I thought was really interesting. But I want you to think about legacy, both the legacy of this work. And so what do you want the legacy of this work to be? What contribution do you want it to make? And then sort of tying that in, and just to finish with us, what are your larger dreams for this future study of Black philanthropy? Either want to talk about a next project or just where you'd want to see this book beginning a conversation that continues. So what do you want this book to do now that it's out here in the world?
Wow. Yeah, well, so as I was writing it, I kept thinking about the givers who are part of this history and who are living it out today, and that I was writing it for them. I was writing for that Black woman today who is taking care of her family, doing her thing, has her career, but it is also giving all the way throughout all of that. And I say, what does she want to know? And so I want for her to feel some affirmation and some recognition in this history, to be seen and to draw strength from that, and to see how she's carrying that forward, and how she might innovate that and send it off to future generations. And I think that's very important in the world of Black philanthropy. I mean, there are all these networks that are being created where Black people are standing up and saying, we are philanthropists, we give. And there are giving circles, as you mentioned. There are networks in the grant making foundation world. There's a whole vibrant universe of things that are happening. So I wanted to show how this is the history of that, right? That's how we got here. And, we'll see where they're going to take us. So I hope that it shows Black women's historians another contribution that they may not have intended to make, right? But they provided these pathways and these ideas that help me articulate this philosophy. And I also hope that Black women's historians, Africana studies scholars, will take another look at philanthropy, and to say, again, you all kind of did this work and opened up these insights for me, and I formally study it. You don't. You had to, because that's what you were interested in. In order to get to where you wanted to get, you had to encounter it and deal with it. But imagine if that was a part of your identity or part of your intended contributions. I think you could help open things up even more. So a lot of people are interested in philanthropy in diverse communities. America's becoming a quote unquote majority minority country, and that has dramatic implications for the way the nonprofit sector will conduct itself and be able to survive in the future. But I think most importantly, it's important for this community to understand its history and where it has come from, and this other insight into it, and be able to own it, and again carry it forward. So I hope that those are the kinds of things that would happen, and I would love to see the work continue, and it is. I have a great colleague, Dr. Kim Williams-Pulfer, who's doing some exciting work about philanthropy in the global South and bringing Caribbean perspectives to this, and I want people to kind of pursue those agendas, because when I was in graduate school, there was only a few people that were doing this, and I could look to and see their articles or see their books and say, okay, I can do this. So I hope there's a whole lot of doc students out there right now who are thinking about doing something about these movements, or thinking about trying to do something in this space, but not sure if they can, or not sure if they should, or may not even have the support in their department or know how to approach it. I hope that they could pick this up and say, okay, right, just like when I read Emmett Carson's book, or when I read Adrian Last Jones' article about Black philanthropy, like those fed me and those kept me going. So I hope that this will do something similar for those coming behind and all those now who are engaged. There are lots of people who are engaging these topics, but from different viewpoints. If we all turn and look at it from this philanthropic viewpoint, we can build this and open this up and create this idea, these histories of philanthropy that actually are more true to what actually happened in the ways that people were giving across different communities. It's not something that only belongs to the elite. It's something that everybody does.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your work, for just the incredible amount of research and painstaking work that it took to bring this story to life. I know I will never look at those little checkbook registers when I see them in the archives the same way again, and just sort of dismiss and pass by, but understand that we can learn a great deal about Black women's lives by looking at giving. It tells us so much about their values, tells us about the kind of world they wanted to create. And those of us that are scholars and are in their sort of legacy, we owe it to them to pay attention to that. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. And I will turn it over to Heather now for the Q&A portion.
All right, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation. We've got some excellent question here. The first one is continuing on the theme of legacies, and it's from Shanette Garrett Scott, and she notes that you kind of already answered part of the question in talking about Agents Charity, but she wants to know if you could speak on the legacies of Walker's philanthropy, particularly Walker's agents and other local Black women, as well as Walker's daughter.
Sure. So, on Walker's daughter, I'm gonna leave that for Alelia Bundle. She's writing the book on Alelia Walker Robinson right now, so that'll be out sometime next year. So we'll let her have her shine, right? Because she deserves that. But yeah, so putting Walker into context, right, with her peers, with the other club women, with the other educators, right? I think that gives us a different way of viewing them. Tiffany hinted at one of the aspects of the legacy for the NAACP executive secretary to articulate in 1952 that the NAACP survived the Depression because of Walker's generosity is pretty powerful. And so I see that whole generation as during that institution building, that post-Reconstruction, early turn of the 20th century period of building up all these networks, right? That was their huge contribution. And historians already talk about that long civil rights movement, right? This is kind of the pieces of that, the pieces they were putting in place, whether or not they would live to see it come to fruition. And so the other thing that I point to in the book is how Gertrude Mozo was writing about Ida B. Wells as a philanthropist in 1894. And she has this whole essay, right, that really documents Black women's philanthropic work across every area of achievement and endeavor. So to me, that also further ingrained this idea that it's not limited to one thing. It's not limited to one area or to people who only have wealth. It's a part of your identity that carries with you, regardless of how you make your livelihood. But there are many different ways for engaging. So I see that legacy also today as foundational to the landscape of Black philanthropy. I talk about this at the end of the book, from the communal ways of giving to Black family reunions, to high net worth individuals who we're all familiar with, who are increasingly turning to some of the professional tools of philanthropy, setting up their own family foundations, using donor advised funds, using philanthropic advisors to set up their strategies and what they're going to do. Giving circles, Tiffany mentioned that already. This is the history of that collective giving, the networks that Madam Walker was in. These women pooled their resources to develop social insurance and other things, much the same way. So it's no surprise that Black women are really flocking to giving circles today. The whole country is going through this revolution of giving circles. Everybody's turning to them, but Black women in particular are resonating with giving circles, and everybody pools money into a fund, and then they collectively decide what issues they're going to support, and then they make grants to their local community. So there's this social element there. And then there's all these networks that I mentioned. So I see Walker's legacy as a part of that, as part of the foundation for this. And I'm careful to say, she didn't create Black philanthropy, right? That's not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that she actually inherits it, right, from the women before her. She socialized into it. But she provides us with this beautiful window into that philanthropic world. She puts her own unique stamp on it because of who she was and how she used her company to do the work of the race. And therefore, she becomes this important foremother for us to grapple with and understand and appreciate today. And the last thing I say about the legacy is I interviewed fundraisers from the Smithsonian's campaign for the National Museum of African American History. And the ways in which they conducted that campaign just reflected an understanding of this tradition. And many of these fundraisers were African American, led under Dr. Lonnie Bunch and the great Adrian Brooks and others who did this work. And so, yes, they got money from Oprah and Robert F. Smith and the late, great Kobe Bryant, but they opened up a whole world. They tapped into this universe of Black generosity, and everyday Black people from all walks of life responded to that campaign in overwhelming numbers. So this history, this heritage is very much alive and well today.
That's actually a great segue into the next question, which is from Michelle Watts. So she says, I read this book as a scholar and a nonprofit professional, and the book is phenomenal. What are the takeaways for the nonprofit sector, especially in light of the sector's need for its own racial reckoning?
Yeah. So one thing I would say is, right, this book sheds light on the idea, right? We know government and we know the private markets were complicit, right, and gave us Jim Crow. But our own beloved nonprofit sector is complicit too. And we don't fully grapple with that. We tend to lay it at the foot of universities only, who may have endowments linked to slavery. And that's an important part of it. But as I said, orphanages wouldn't take in Black children. Social service agencies wouldn't, so other aspects of the field are complicit, and they have to grapple with that. And I think that is the historical harm that is a problem for engaging donors of color today. In national studies, donors of color report lower levels of cultivation and engagement by fundraisers than white donors, right? So that's a problem that the field created. And part of it is this history of harm and resultant suspicion and hurt and pain, unacknowledged pain. That's part of that. And so I think organizations, this further affirms that call to grapple with our own organizations' histories of engaging these communities, but then see these communities, see African Americans on their own philanthropic terms. We have the whole fundraising profession was literally created based off of the motivations and desires of wealthy white businessmen. And so everybody else has kind of been filtered into campaigns and things that ultimately, were based on their preferences. But one of the things I point out about the Smithsonian, how they deliberately created multiple pathways, multiple ways of engaging people, and people responded because the case was culturally relevant and it was so powerful. So those are the kinds of things I'm challenging organizations to do. Look at their own histories of engaging this community, what harm they might need to address, and then to start seeing these communities on their own terms, because they've been giving from the beginning. And whether or not organizations reach out and start engaging them, they're going to keep giving. a giving circle is a way to have your own philanthropic agenda, right? And most of the giving goes through the church still too, but then it's redistributed and goes to different purposes. So I think this is a wake-up call, further wake-up call for the sector to pay more attention to diverse communities, but it gives the proper lenses for valuing and understanding and seeing the philanthropy on its own terms rather than on externally imposed terms.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Charmaine Champion Shaw. And they ask, while there is major work being done on the Walker Theater in Indianapolis at this time, so many of the historic sites where Black engagement in philanthropy and achievement in and around Madame's life have been decimated, destroyed, and ignored. With important contributions happening about how we memorialize contributions of key historic Black figures like Madame C.J. Walker, how do you feel about further memorializing sites where she lived and worked, and what suggestions would you make to the city of Indianapolis and on IUPUI's campus?
Wow. Yeah. No. So the pre-COVID hope and dream was for a book tour through the 7 or 8 places where Madame Walker lived, so that we could kind of retrace her steps and connect with community-based organizations along the way. And you're right. In Delta, there's only a little marker, and there's not much left from many of the other places. Indianapolis is unique because of the theater, which was the headquarters for her company, and then it was repurposed after the company changed ownership, and you're right, now it's being invested in so that it can continue to serve the community. Her mansion is still in New York and under new ownership, and there are plans there to do some things to connect that to Black women's entrepreneurs. So all those things I think are important and should lead the way. But some of the organizations she funded are still around. The Flanner House is still here in Indianapolis, deeply rooted in the community on the west side of Indianapolis, and just as it was back during Walker's day, on the front lines of the plagues there that were going through, the tuberculosis plague that Indianapolis experienced. Flanner House is helping people deal with COVID right now. So again, there's another aspect of that legacy. I think it's always important, to your last point about how to preserve these. I think we've got to listen to the communities that are a part of these neighborhoods where these sites are, and they must be a part of that visioning and that understanding in order to really grapple with the history and also figure out how to carry it forward and memorialize it properly.
All right, so our next question comes from Alelia Bundles herself. So she says, Tyrone, you've talked about the concept of self-made versus mutually made. Can you talk about that in terms of Madame Walker?
Yeah, so she's commonly known as the first self-made female millionaire, right? And there's a whole lot of debate over who's first. I don't deal with that. I'm not interested in that because I think there's room enough for everybody, and we do need a better history of wealth and how it developed. But the historians long ago put to bed this idea of the self-made myth, right? We know nobody's self-made. Everybody has somebody who helps them in some way. And so Pamela Walker Laird is a historian who wrote this book called Pull, which is all about kind of deconstructing this myth. And she re-articulates this idea that was asserted by a historian before her, that people are actually mutually made, that there are people along your journey who help you in one way or another. And I'm indebted to my mentor and colleague, Nancy Robertson, for turning me on to that book and that idea. But that resonated so well because when we see that, we can honor Walker's tenacity and her assertiveness and just this dream and this relentlessness, and at the same time we can honor the networks that she came out of. We can honor those washerwomen, we can honor those club women and those church women, and even the agents who she coordinates and brings together, because all of those things had a factor in helping to produce her, and she in turn starts to create and invest in more networks, right, to propel these same values forward. And so I think that lens of mutually made is very powerful for understanding the importance of relationships, and even in the research my colleagues are doing on women's philanthropy, right? Women's philanthropy is very relational. It's not transactional, right? So this gives a way of honoring where she came from, how her story actually evolved, and then how that has impact on the way in which she saw her responsibility to others and the way she tried to distribute her resources to address that and express that.
All right, so our next question is from Caritha Mitchell, and she wants to know, can you say more about how Walker made giving part of her agent's credentials? Was there any pushback, or did it just make the company's culture overwhelmingly oriented towards philanthropy?
Yeah, so So I talk about this in the book. So they set up these clubs, and they wanted the clubs to be autonomous. She wanted them to handle their own money and whatever they were wanting to do. She just wanted to kind of bring them together. And as Tiffany pointed out in her book, there's this influence of NACW there, right? That she's kind of mimicking and modeling that. And one of the things I add into the conversation is that there's some fraternal exposure there too. Walker was part of the Court of Philanthropy, and what I did is I went and I talk about building our own archives as something that we have to do in doing this work, right? I went and I was able to find a ritual book for the Court of Philanthropy from 1914, around the time when this is happening. And when I held that alongside the ritual book for the Walker agents, it was remarkably similar. Right. And then when we look at what we know about the fraternal orders, right, and again, we're not talking about the Divine Nine, we're talking about the social lodges and others that existed before that, right? We know that they had values of charity, they had values of fidelity and loyalty and other things, and they built all these internal cultural practices. I love and I use Imani Perry's idea of Black formalism here as a way to kind of dig deep into what this culture was like, right? This is not about the external white gaze. This is what Black people were doing in their own controlled spaces and how they conducted themselves. And so the Black formal culture of the agents clubs speaks to this responsibility to others, speaks to this notion that yes, we're beauty agents, we're beauticians, but we are engaged in acts of quote unquote divine service, right? We're serving our race through this noble profession, and we're bringing voice to the community and bringing resources and opportunity to the community. So all of those things are some of the things I try to unravel or bring together in the book to express that culture and how it showed up in the agent clubs.
And then later, I think part of where you see that he just getting enshrined is after Walker is dead, and even other beauty colleges that are not under the Walker system literally build those kinds of acts of giving and political action into their beauty school curricula. And that to me is directly tied back to Walker as a pioneer in the industry and setting that tone for beauticians to come.
Okay, so our next question is from Tiffany Player, and she wants to know, could you talk about how Walker's Gospel of Giving fit in with other African Americans' efforts to secure government aid, particularly in the form of pensions and other public monies?
Yeah, so I kind of and I talk a little bit about this because because of what we know, the ways in which many of the club women will kind of start these programs, and then demand for state aid to kind of carry them on. And so I see this as kind of tied to that, and giving voice to another aspect of that whole activist strain that's a part of Black women's identity. So I think those things are related, and I use philanthropy as an umbrella for trying to see those activities. I talk about Black women's activism. I talk about their community work and their uplift work, and I talk about that fundraising. But I said one of the things I saw unifying this, whether they're making demands upon the government or they're soliciting donors or creating their own programs, is this notion of generosity. So I see a connection to those, and then I argue for that in the book.
Okay, so our next question is from LaShawn Harris, and she says, this is such a great conversation. Thank you so much. In 1912, Madam Walker donated travel funds for Mary Church Terrell and a few other NACW women to visit the jail cell of 16-year-old Hampton, Virginia teen and convicted murderer Virginia Christian. Did Madam Walker contribute funds or lend her support to other early 20th century legal justice campaigns centered on aiding incarcerated Black men, women, and children?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So there is an example where Madam Walker helped to secure the pardon for a man who turns out to be her nephew, who is incarcerated for murder in Mississippi. And so she has her attorney, Freeman B. Ransom, start working with attorneys in Mississippi and secures his pardon. Now, in some of the newspaper coverage and the archival information about Ransom, there were some references that he had done this at least 3 times. And now I could not find the trail or be able to kind of verify that or know exactly what those were. But that would suggest to me that that perhaps this wasn't the only case. There were a couple of newspaper reports that Madam Walker, while she was traveling across the Midwest and holding these events where she would introduce the company and even demonstrate her products, that she would often kind of, if there were any charges at the door, she would take those proceeds and donate them to charity. And there's a couple of newspaper spots where it says that she's identified the Legal Defense Fund for an AME minister accused of murder. So this definitely is on her radar. And then if you think again about the anti-lynching work that's being done and how she ultimately gives $5,000 to the NAACP's effort, you see kind of those connections to it. So yes, this legal defense is an important part here. The anti-lynching, all of those things are connected for her.
And she also, I remember when she travels to Haiti, she also visits prisons in Haiti and gives money to families of folks who are incarcerated. So she saw this as sort of a diasporic battle, which is, and I just think that's another area of really kind of exploration of looking at the fundraising to the unexpected fundraisers for many kind of things around incarceration and things like that. But yeah, she did it in Haiti as well.
Right. And in line with your work, and Keisha's work, right? She was going international too, right? As she starts to develop this Pan-African consciousness near the end of her life. And she's very much seeing these connections, and she's engaging with Marcus Garvey and Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Du Bois and others. So she's, she's very consistent with the things that have been articulated in other texts.
Okay, so our next question is from Keon Burns, and they ask, in terms of Black women's philanthropy, is there a rich history of them giving to white institutions in addition to Black ones? For example, Osceola McCarty, a laundry woman born in 1908 who saved her entire life to donate over $120,000 to the University of Southern Mississippi.
Yeah. So, and the cool thing about that, right, too, is she was a washerwoman, right? So there's that history again, right? This notion that generosity is not about, what you have, is what you do with what you have, right? So I think that this is important because it shows how this generosity is actually very forgiving, right? There's no reason for Ms. McCarty to give money to Ole Miss. I mean, in the big scheme of things, right? But she does it anyway. And so, again, one of my colleagues, Nancy Marie Robertson, looked at, Black women and white women's work in the YWCA, right? There's all this philanthropy going on there. So there is this cross engagement. Betty Collier's work on Thomas's work on the Black and white church women and how they're navigating these spaces and doing work, sometimes together, sometimes in their separate spaces. So yes, I mean, that tradition is a part of this too. But there's this fundamental commitment that's anchored in their own communities. And in many ways, I kind of liken it to that Black patriotism. The idea that we've had soldiers who have fought in every single American conflict, even though their rights were never guaranteed or secure, right? Which says something to me about their notion of patriotism and what the country could be and should be. And, Madam Walker says many times that, when she's speaking on behalf of Black soldiers during World War I, that, they're over there, they're fighting, they're dying. And when they come back, we expect to enjoy all the rights that they're dying for. And in many ways, this idea of Black generosity is similar because Black people are giving to places and spaces that under normal stances, perhaps you wouldn't, right? You have every reason not to. I came across through the work of an Irish historian, a group of enslaved Africans at a church in Richmond, Virginia in 1847, who raised money and sent it to Ireland to help white people dying under the potato famine. Enslaved people doing that, right? So again, this idea of Black generosity, I think, is something very powerful, and I hope more will turn attention to it and help us to further develop it and understand it.
Okay, so I have 3 questions for you now, but they're all in the same vein, and people are just wanting to know the names of some of the people that you've mentioned. So there was the question about who is the author of Pull.
Okay, that's Pamela Walker Laird, Laird. Pamela Walker Laird. Mm-hmm.
And then Ann Bailey wants to know the name of the colleague who is working on the biochemical aspect of philanthropy and if there's anything published.
Yes, Sarah Conrath, Konrath. Sarah Conrath. Yes, she's very widely published. She has a whole lot of stuff out there on empathy. Yeah, there's a whole rich literature that she's developed. And she's a social psychologist that focuses on philanthropy.
And then she also wants to know the name of the person working on philanthropy in the Global South.
Yes, my colleague, Dr. Kim Williams-Pulfer. Kim Williams-Pulfer, Pulfer. And she's doing incredible work about Black women in civil society in the Bahamas. Yeah, and she also has a piece on the conversation about 4 giving trends by African Americans during this pandemic. So if you go to theconversation.com, look up Kim Williams-Pulfer, you can read her article.
Okay, and now the next question is Emily Perdan wants to know if you could talk about Madam Walker's role in life in Pittsburgh. Although that time of her life was short, how did her work change the lives there in terms of activism and philanthropy?
Yeah, so I kind of glossed over that because I didn't see much from what I was trying to focus on. I know that she connected with an AME church there. Alelia Bundles has a beautiful chapter about her Pittsburgh experiences there. And that's where kind of, Alelia College gets going, which is an important part of this story. But I did not look at her direct impact on Pittsburgh. She was there for such a short amount of time. And one of the things we know is she traveled so much. She would move to these places, but then she would travel so much. St. Louis and Indianapolis were different because she actually set down roots. She was in St. Louis for more than 15 years. And even though she was only in Indianapolis for 6, this is where, her first, kind of real home, her physical house was there. She built the factory there. She set down roots. And even as she moves and leaves and goes to New York, the headquarters is still there and she still comes back. So to me, that those 2 places, because of this root effect that she set down roots there, I focused on those to tell that story. But I think that's a great question to look at potential impacts in places like Pittsburgh, where she spent some time as well.
Okay, so we have time for one more question before we close it out. So if you can get this, so Shanette asked, does Dr. Freeman see a link between Black philanthropy, generosity, and activism around reparations from Callie House to today?
Oh yeah, I do, because this is part of the claims. These are the injustices that they're arguing for, to address, and to repair and to deal with. So, and when you look at organizations like NCOBRA and others, right? I mean, that's coming out of this voluntary tradition of coming together around these issues and urging and advocating for them. So yes, I think all of that that activism that goes way back, as you point out by the way you phrased the question, is a big part of this, and I do see is an extension and a part of this history and heritage. Yes, absolutely.
All right, well, it looks like we're just about out of time. I will let Tiffany and Tyrone go ahead and close us out with any final words. Tiffany, you're muted.
Okay, I'll just be really brief. Just buy the book. I mean, it really is that simple. It really will just make you rethink everything you think you know about Walker, about philanthropy, and just give new insights into Black women's history. And it's that history of Black abundance, like Kesey Lehman talks about, right? Like this is Black abundance in its finest, both the book and the subject matter. So just thank you, Tyrone, for this work. It's so good and so important, and I can't wait to see the works that it inspires after this.
Oh, thank you. If I may, I'd like to just kind of leave with a short passage that I think kind of sums it up for me, that generosity is ultimately a form of hope. We give as an expression of the possibilities to which we aspire and that we want to make real. We give not only because the need is so overwhelmingly great, but in spite of its greatness. We are not deterred, though we might be daunted. Our gift represents the possibility of a different tomorrow. The hope wrapped up in each gift, no matter its size, is the hope of Daniel against Goliath. Over time, when our hope is merged with the hope of others through giving, mountains are moved and rivers are reversed. A gift by an African American during Jim Crow was an act of resistance and hope, an expression of dignity, and a signal that no matter the conditions, as long as one could give, the human soul would not be crushed. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your attention. Really appreciate your support and interest. And thank you so much to Tiffany and to Heather and Michael, the whole University of Illinois Press team. Big shout out to Dawn Durante. She's moved on, but she's a big part of this story too. So thanks to all of you. Really appreciate you. God bless you.